And thank you for listening to the first edition of Monster Power in Depth. Today we'll be talking to the one and only Gene Patterson of Bigfoot fame, longtime Bigfoot driver and crewman. Worked for Dan Patrick for on and off for a little while with Samson, and was one of the original shoes in one of the two Stomper bully trucks, the Breen Brothers Stomper bully truck that toured the country with TNT back in the late 80s. And in recent years, crewed for Feld on some of the Monster Jam machines. Of course, in upcoming weeks, we'll also have a few others, Scott Stevens and Seth Dalton, and hopefully some other names to be announced if everything goes well. And bear with us just a little bit as we are trying to clean up the audio and the interview style. Everything's been a little bit rushed right now, but we're just trying to make this work for the time being. We do hope you enjoy this, and without further delay, the one and only Gene Patterson.
Gene, thanks a lot for being with us tonight.
It's my pleasure.
And I'm going to jump right in. How did you get started in monster trucks? What was your background, and what from that led you to working in monster trucks?
Well, as a high schooler, I guess, I pretty much had my head in a lot of different types of hot rod type magazines, and my brothers were into cars. My oldest brother had a Camaro. My next one had a Chevelle. So back in the 70s and 80s, I mean, that was the thing. And we started hanging around some guys that had some small garages, and they actually had some pulling trucks. And I became involved in the pulling industry. They had a couple Chevrolets, and I helped build two of the pulling trucks that they had, and kind of sharpened, I guess, as a high schooler, just kind of took to that. And I kept seeing, from time to time, I'd see a pretty big four-wheel drive truck driving around our area, which was right here in central Missouri. And I was kind of fascinated with it. I seen him at a couple truck pulls, and somebody told me his name was John Breen. And that's kind of where it got left at. And then in the early 80s, I began noticing that Bigfoot, number one, the original truck on 48s, was in several magazines. And I thought, wow, this is pretty cool. And I thought it was going to do a car crush, or attempt to do a car crush, I should say, in Jefferson City, Missouri. So I loaded up my camera gear and headed out to this little dirt track that we have. And here comes Bigfoot and John Breen's truck and a couple other large four-wheel drive trucks in this big parade. And he actually drove it from St. Louis to Jefferson City, which was rather unique back then. And it was I think it was a truck and tractor pull, and they had big rigs pulling. And John and Bob and some of the other teams that was there, they would pull the trucks across the weigh scales and whatnot. And I was in the pits, and I just kept looking at this truck. And when he brought the the American flag down the track, and the national anthem was playing, and he was crab walking it down there. Of course, he had all the KC lights lit up, and I was just in there, I guess, with my mouth wide open, thinking, this was just so unreal to be here in the presence of this truck that I'd only seen in magazines. As the evening went on, there was a few alcoholic beverages consumed, and we were standing there, and they got ready to do the car crush. And they brought two cars out, and they set them end to end, and one of them was an AMC Rebel, and I'm not sure what the other one was called. But Bob kind of approached the cars, and he revved the motor up and had all the lights on, and he kind of like gunned the motor, and he'd stop, and then he started trying to creep up on the cars, and one of them slid out from under him. And the truck was all kicked up in the air, and it was all twisted up, and Bob was just gunning it for everything it had, and there was a guy riding with him, and he had this big smile on his face, and I thought, wow, who is this, and how do I get to be over there, And it ended up he never did get over the cars, and there was a lot of booing and whatnot going on, and they brought parts down to fix it the next day, and I guess he went over it the next night. Well, I didn't go back the next night. Well, as time went on, I come to find out that was John Breen. And, this was the mid-'80s then, and monsters were starting to pop up everywhere, and I was on my way home from work one day, and I noticed a big blazer being built, and it was John Breen again. So I stopped in there, and that's kind of the start of everything that I got involved with.
Now, this blazer would end up being one of John Breen's Mad Dogs, or was this a separate thing at the time, or had he even named it?
Well, his first truck just had a dog on the door, and it had like some big wheels on it. And that was the Stepside Chevrolet, and that's the one I'd seen, and that's the one that I actually have pictures of. And people ask me from time to time, "Gosh, how lucky were you to?" I'm like, I don't know. I just happened to be there. I didn't know it was going to be the start of nearly 30 plus years of monster trucks in this industry. But yeah, it was John's Mad Dog. He called it Mad Dog, and it was just a character name that they'd come up with. And I just stopped in and introduced myself and told him that I'd met him several times in the past. And he really, he's just like, yeah, well, whatever. And I said, well, I just shot my mouth off. I showed him the pictures of his truck next to Bigfoot, and I said, I can get pictures of this Mad Dog, this truck buildup, if you'll let me take them, published in a magazine. And he's like, really? And I'm like, yeah, I can do this. And not knowing, I was just trying anyway just to see this buildup of this truck. And I just started snapping pictures, and of course the internet wasn't around. Was no fax machines, no computers. So everything was done via the telephone or via the mail, the regular mail. And I'd contacted Peterson's Full Wheel and Off-Road, that's what it used to be called. And they told me what the criteria was, what they needed. And I literally took probably 150 to 200 black and white photographs. Wow. They wanted a lot of black and white, and probably 75 to 100 color shots from the initial framework to, they took the rear ends out of the step-side Chevrolet and put them underneath this one, which was 2.5 tons. John come up with this 2 transfer case idea, using a military transfer case and a 205 transfer case from Chevrolet to get a lower gear ratio because of the 2.5 ton rear end. And he actually had the tires that they used in the Bigfoot number 2's photo shoot on the same magazine. He purchased those. It had the same Bigfoot type mirrors on it. I mean, back then everybody ordered everything from Bigfoot because no one really knew that, cosmetic wise, that was, if they were using them, everybody wanted it. So in '85 when the magazine actually came out, there it was, Mad Dog 2 photography by Gene Patterson, and that pretty much started. I knew right then that prior to that monster trucks is what I wanted to do. So.
Wow. And then how did that? Now you drove Stomper for a little while.
Yes. Well, I went on the road. I had a regular job, and I used to go with John and them, and then they were doing a few TNT shows with Ed Hart with the Mad Dog 2 truck, the Blazer.
Mm-hmm.
They were doing lots of car shows. We went down into Arkansas, and we actually crushed cars inside of the bar. And then we took the Blazer down the street and floated it in the river. And that was a big thing back then, but it seemed like John really capitalized on it. He used to take it floating all the time. And I thought that was pretty cool. And then we didn't really get separated, but I was working my regular job, and I was trying to follow the whole monster truck scene as it was. You couldn't pick up a magazine that didn't have a monster truck in it. Pretty soon, I found myself working at a body shop that was doing some body shop work for John, and they had some mud racers, and they said they knew John was building another truck, and I went back up by shop, and he said, yeah, he'd been contacted by Ed Hart, which was with NTPA, and he had close friends with TNT, and they needed this truck, a Chevrolet truck, to compete against Bigfoot. They'd already started a big advertising campaign, and the guys that were building the Stomper Bully were a couple of truck pullers, and they were dragging their feet, and they knew John from his Mad Dog days, and they knew he could get it done pretty quick, so they contacted John, and I think within like 40 days or something, by 45 days, they had the Stomper bully built.
Wow.
And then he started going to some NTPA pulls and some TNT events, and I kind of got in between jobs, and the company I was working for sold out. I'd lived in the state of California, and then I was living in Massachusetts, and was still trying to keep up with John and everything, and I just said, enough is enough. I think I'm going to try this monster truck industry out, and that was in '86. And started going with John with the Stomper truck, and then we were in New Hampshire, and John said that he was going to build the Mad Dog Racer because TNT had already started talking about the racing series, and he wanted somebody to drive it, and he said, here, and I want you to drive it.
Now, you drove that truck from, 86 to what, about 87, 88?
Yeah, 87. Late '86, we were, like I said, we were in New Hampshire doing a fair, and back then the trucks were regular pickups.
Right.
The Stomper truck that John had, it had electric windows, electric locks, radio work, tilt. This was a top-of-the-line Chevrolet truck, and cosmetically everything worked, and they were steel and slow, cumbersome vehicles, but, we had an injector motor in it later. In '87, we done the whole big thing with Stomper versus Bigfoot, and they actually had two Stompers. They'd finally finished theirs, and we were doing a lot of smaller shows with the tractor pulls. Like we did the Omni in Atlanta, I did those, and Memphis, and their truck, because they were shooting it for television. I think at that time probably TNN was doing some off-site filming,
right?
And they would go to the big domes because TNT was doing a lot of the big domes back then. So I kind of stayed on the lower, I guess you could say it, the B team, and I got to know a lot of people from Bigfoot because we could sit there and watch the pull, and then they'd throw some cars out on the dirt track, and then we'd go out there and run over the cars about 4 or 5 times. And actually, I learned a lot about the truck. I learned a lot about, how to perform in smaller arenas, and really it was more crowd-orientated. We didn't do like the 2-hour pit parties that they do now, or 3 hours. We did do autograph sessions and whatnot, but it was more of a one-on-one, even back then. And we went through the whole spring and in the summer of '87 doing some NTPA tractor pulls and TNT pulls, and they'd start doing a few outdoor events. And then we went to Houston. I guess it would have been late spring, and we had both Stompers there. Gravedigger was there. I can't remember if King Kong had 1 or 2 trucks there. Clydesdale, Texas Toy. There was a huge squad of trucks, and we were all overshadowed by Bigfoot. I think they had probably Bigfoot 4 there.
Mm-hmm.
Could have been 6. I think it was 4 though. And they brought their shuttle van, and everybody that was there was used to running the little smaller arenas. And this was the first time a lot of us gearheads was in a great big dome this big. I think I actually went 2 rounds and threw both drive shafts out, but it just wasn't set up to be doing what we were doing. And I met the late Steve Evans, and that was the whole start of Power Tracks and the whole TNN craze, and it just took off from there.
Watching a lot of that footage, you could see the difference in the driving style. I guess you mentioned these coming from smaller arenas. The way in which you would approach jumping onto the cars at that time in a larger dome, you may have been more used to getting speed, or was that actually affected by running in the smaller arena?
Yeah, well, it was but the suspensions back then, some of us had 7 inches, 8 inches of travel, and we thought that was a lot. We were just using off-the-shelf shocks. The rear end setup that we had under the Stomper was much like the little Barefoot S10, where the rear ends were rotated upside down. Then we had Corvette third members, and then drive shafts going back to try to get the dry shaft angles and get a lot more gear reduction. So we were really geared really, really low. We used a 5-ton transfer case in that Stomper truck. So it was set up for pulling the sleds, and it was set up for just doing car crashes. I mean, you could stand it on its back bumper anytime you wanted. But now all of a sudden we're running down to an arena where you got 300-400 feet before you're hitting cars, and we're maxed out turning 7,000 RPM, and it's like we're not going anywhere. So we knew right then we had to start changing our game plan. However, I stepped up my game in the spring of that year because I was still competing against Bigfoot, and some of their drivers were starting to launch their trucks over the cars. So I was at a show in probably Quincy, Illinois, I believe, or it was an NTPA tractor pull. Photo Joe was up there and sent John a bunch of pictures after the show, and I thought we did an okay job. You know, we got some air and stuff like that, and I got a picture, you know, here at my house of Stomper Bully, and we were probably 4 or 5 feet up above the cars, and there was like 6 cars flying through the air. John got it, and he was just amazed that I was doing that with that truck. And I was like, well, I really didn't think I was running. He goes, oh, no, that's perfect. You know, just keep running it that hard. And then as he was building the Mad Dog Racer truck, and his brother Bobby that used to travel on the road with me, which could basically put anything together at any given time,
Right.
he decided he wanted to get behind the wheel. And, of course, family's more important, and I understood. So that kind of left me out looking for a direction to go. I run into John and him, of course, when I was crewing for Jim Kramer at several TNT events, and Bobby was driving, and in fact, my first show that I drove when I turned Bigfoot 6 over in Columbus, Ohio, which was a Ed Hart. They had them 2 trucks there, and you know, a lot of those guys from TNT, well, especially John, I mean, he knew Ed Hart, and Ed Hart was really trying to get into that market because he saw that on the writing on the walls, these monster trucks were going to be a big attraction. I mean, even though he was one of the chief executive officers at NTPA, he knew that trucks and tractor pulling just weren't going to keep the crowds coming, and these monster trucks was you know, something that was really going to start bringing the crowds in. So that was his and my first driving behind the wheel. Now, I'd already been crewing for a little while before that for Bigfoot, but in between stunts there, I guess, we were in Nashville at a TNT show at the old Speedway, and it was back, you know, they was trying all kinds of different courses back then. I mean, it was we had an inside lane, outside lane, and I was down there with some friends of mine that had a body shop that had their mud vehicle down there. It was called Magnum Force, and we was just joking around, and Earl Daggett came up and introduced himself to me and said that he knew that I was possibly looking at moving on, and he'd kind of heard back, you know, it was a small world back then, and heard through the grapevine that Bobby was going to start driving, and wanted to know if I'd be interested in driving his truck for the show because his son just didn't feel comfortable in it or whatever the reason. I got my helmet, you know, and I kind of talked to John, and I said, would you have a problem with me? Because I really felt still obligated to John. He'd given me my start in monster trucks. So he says, no, go for it, you know, do what you got to do, you know. So that's the first time I drove a blower motor, and that was the Thumper truck, Earl's truck. And I think I took it to the semifinals, and never even been in the truck before, and Earl was just, like, ecstatic. He couldn't believe it, you know, and I'm like, well, you know, I think there's more in it. And we actually started talking there in Nashville about going to work for him. And I talked to my family at the time and thought, well, you know, I kind of like what his operation was clean. You know, he was one of the first ones with a big semi, and just kind of back and forth, really not for sure. I knew ultimately I really wanted to go to work at Bigfoot, but this was something that I had to prove to myself that I could actually drive, quite a few trucks. So it just happened to be that I made a phone call in between that gig and some other stuff I had working, and talked to Jim Kramer, and they said, come on up, and they was having basically a tryout. And I went to St. Louis in the fall of '87 for a driver interview / tryout. Starting with Bigfoot, when I went up there, and back then we used to do driver training. And I went to Jerseyville, Illinois, to one of the other drivers that worked for Bigfoot. There was 3 Bigfoot trucks parked out in the field, and they had several stacks of cars and some dirt hills, and I was a kid. I mean, I was 25, but I was a kid. And seeing those Bigfoot trucks, and I climbed in one, and I believe Ken Kelling rode around with me and showed me how to, because we took them out of 2-wheel drive and 4-wheel drive. I mean, that was a big thing because they ran lockers with the 5-ton rear ends. And Jim and him he told me that when they're turning around in arenas, you have to kick it into 2-wheel drive or you'll get the front end all bound up. So Kenny showed me all that, and after about 15 minutes, 20 minutes driving around with him, then he got out, and I went out there and hit the cars like 4 or 5 times, launched the truck up in the air, and it was a huge difference between from where I was with the Stomper truck to this truck. But I had, I knew what the truck was doing. I'd been driving the truck with rear steering, and several other guys that were up there had never even been in a monster truck. So they called me the next week and said, you got a job if you want it. And, I mean, yeah, I started crewing with Jim, and they put me with Jim because Jim, at that time, was still doing some of the TV stuff, some of the Ford commercials, a lot of the U.S. Hot Rod Association shows, and we were doing Ford dealer displays. So they put me with Jim because they knew I had driving experience, and I could take the rig and everything out or go with, for whatever case it needed to be, and I could do a dealer display or auto parts store display with the truck. I could tire it down, put tires on it, load it up, and then Jim could fly in if he had to, or if he had to fly home if we were out for 2 or 3 weeks. And I had this background of driving Stomper with Don, so there was a lot of other guys there at Bigfoot that were just basically off the street, and they could put tires on, but they didn't have any time behind the wheel. So I think that put me on the fast track right there to get up to the head of the class. The whole thing with the double rollover, getting onto that was really freakishly, I don't know. But after every accident that I ever had at Bigfoot, Bob Chandler would step right up and immediately make changes. I won't say he related me to him on how he used to break parts, but I was Bigfoot's test pilot too, and Jim could seem to hold the trucks together, and I could find a weak link. But we immediately changed the leaf spring center pin bolts because we figured out that the center pin that hold the leaf springs together had broken the day before, and there was ever no way of seeing that because with the U-bolt assemblies that we had. And then we immediately started scribing lines on the leaf springs and painting the leaf springs with a line on the inside towards the rear end, changing the leaf spring bolts to bigger bolts, so then you could visually see if one of the springs had shifted. And we get guys come up to us at shows and they'd see that, and they're like, well, that's a great idea, and then the next week they'd have the same thing on their truck. So that used to be a big joke that we could mount a Pepsi can on the underneath Bigfoot somewhere and spray paint it black, and somebody'd see it, and the next week they'd have it on their truck. They didn't know what it did, but they had to have it. If Bigfoot was using it, they had to have it. And that was a kind of a gimmick that we used to try a lot of stuff on the truck, and we put a lot of stuff on the trucks that didn't even work or do anything to take away from the stuff that we were actually using to try to get the upper hand. I mean, there were some pretty neat tricks we were doing with the leaf spring trucks. I mean, while I was there with 6 and 7, and as far as motor placement, front ladder bar suspension parts and stuff like that, that we would do some other things around the vehicle to just take that attention away from those spots.
Now, you say you started driving in Columbus, and as you drove, when was the moment, as yourself and as a group at Bigfoot, that the sport was getting to where you had to go faster to the building?
It was probably later that year, and at that time, I was still running with Andy Brass, and Jim, and they were putting us three together because they were getting ready to send Andy out. Right after I started, they were going to put Andy out in the truck on the West Coast by himself, and I was going to take Andy's place for Jim. And I'd watched Jim drive, and even then, we were starting to push trucks a lot harder at a lot of the U.S. hot rod events, Candlestick Park, especially the California event. A lot of the bigger events, we were hitting high. I mean, with the manual valve body, Jim was putting it in drive and giving it all it had, so it was, we started stepping up our act pretty quick, and we knew we needed to start changing suspension designs and ladder bar supports and different shocks. I mean, we had Deutsche Tech, which was a big pre-runner type shock absorber at the time, and we were always looking for larger shocks, but that you could buy over the counter, because the nitrogen type shock absorbers really hadn't been introduced to monster trucks yet. So I mean, we had Rough Countries, and they were a sponsor, of course. We had Rugged Trails at the very beginning. Then we had Monroe shock absorbers, and even some of our signature series shock absorbers, the Bigfoot series, they were actually a custom valved shock absorber off the shelf that we were trying out on the trucks. But we, as a team, we kind of felt like we were behind because a lot of the trucks were starting to run injected motors, and we were still running the Predator type series. But we didn't think that we needed to step up to that. Bob was always against the injected motors because of the way they were on or off. It seemed like on or off. In the Barefoot trucks, a lot of Steph's trucks out on the West Coast, why the alcohol was forgiving, I guess you could say, and it let the motors run cooler. It just seemed like they didn't have the control that we had with the carbureted motors. So I think our driving style suited the lower performance, so we made up for it with our driving style. And I mean, we put a lot of guys on the trailers that they had a lot bigger motors, and thinking, hey, we can outrun Bigfoot. And we put a lot of them on the trailer just with the guys that we had behind the wheel. And with that being said, obviously back then, Bob, at a lot of the bigger events, we would always record all the events. The crew guy was responsible for taping the event. Sometimes we had an extra crew member that taped the event. Sometimes Bob would be there and we'd tape the event. And every Tuesday morning, we'd have weekly meetings at Bigfoot, and we'd sit in the conference room and we'd review everybody's driving, where they was at, if they just did a truck pull, or if they did a TNT race, or if they did a U.S. hot rod race, whatever it was. And each driver would have the opportunity to tell each other, well, maybe we should try to do this, or you should have did this, or you should have did that. And with that concept, it made each and every one of us at that time want to drive harder and do a better job. I mean, people looked up to Bigfoot, they still look up to Bigfoot. So we had, not only were we carrying an image of Bigfoot, we were expected to win. So in order to win with something that might not be as advanced as some of the other trucks that were out there at that time, we made up for it, again, like I said, with our driving style.
And that seemed to have been a testament to Bigfoot over the years, even if when you get into the early 90s, seeing where there were certain setbacks because of promotional grievances and things like that, you would bring out an old truck, the team would bring out an older truck like 4, and in 1990 you guys ran door-to-door with a truck like the Equalizer, the truck that Scott Stevens was running at that time, that were really advanced, and you guys were still pushing them with older equipment.
Well, when our in-house mechanics that we had, and Bob Palfreeman, Roy Hoosier, Jay Diekman, they were doing a fabulous job of keeping the trucks every week. I mean, when you got back from on the road, you filled the check sheet out. What you thought needed to be done to the truck, what possibly needs to be done. They would look at the schedule and see which truck had to leave first. That would be the truck that got the attention, and then work down the line. They didn't have time really to get into the whole tube frame industry, and that's where Dan Patrick came in from his pulling tractor days, and Bob and Dan, we went back a long way, and he built several two-wheel drive funny cars for U.S. Hot Rod, and he built a dragster for him, and thought that class. So that's where we actually contracted with him to come out and start our race program. But number 4 really took the most changes of all, like you said, after we had the Bigfoot Bash in Nashville where he totally destroyed the truck. I mean, Bob was all for parking the truck, but the team at the shop said, no, kind of like the Bionic Man, we can rebuild it. And we changed a ton of stuff on that truck. And when we introduced it as Snakebite in '91, I mean, we were running with a lot of tube frame trucks out there, 4-link trucks, and I think I finished possibly 5th or 6th that year in the first year of the Pin to Point series. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, we could go 1 or 2 rounds, and we was pretty much out of our league with that truck. It was more for the Hot Wheels team and of the design of the truck to get it out there. So, but yeah, I still say that truck, the owners of it today, they could still do indoor arenas with that truck today. The suspension that's underneath that truck is very capable of handling a lot of your smaller promoters, the Torgensons. Maybe they could run with Beckley a little bit. I mean, obviously a lot of these guys are pushing the envelope. I mean, it'd be hard on the driver, but I think if there was somebody out there doing the smaller shows and just wanted to do car crushers and whatnot, or do a display, that truck would do an outstanding job of it still today. And I mean, we're talking, 30 plus years ago,
right.
The truck was built.
When you talk about going through changes, it was most famously seen in the version that Rich Hoosier drove with TNT, but that truck was really an old Bigfoot truck at one point.
Right, and it had when Rich drove it, it was fully carpeted interior, electric windows too, steel cab, and then we put fiberglass fiberglass bed sides on the back. Still had the tilt front end, still run triple carburetors on it. So I filled in for Rich in Winchester there, I believe, at the expo. Is that where?
Would that be Fishersville?
Fishersville. Yeah, I actually went to a show there to fill in for Rich. He was off, and that was the year that USA was dominating. USA won, and we were tuning the carburetors in between rounds, and Bob wanted me to go because he knew that I'd been working with Jim, and Jim had actually taught me some few tricks on those Predator carburetors, and we were trying to tune them in between rounds, just try to get more performance out of it. But that truck was handling great on 2 and 3 sets of cars back then.
Now, as you moved in, you mentioned going into '91. You drove 4 through '91. You drove 9 a little bit. Building 8, did you ever drive 8?
Yes, I did. Number 8 was built primarily for Andy Brass. Mm-hmm. Everything in it was for small.
All right.
And when we put that truck together, Andy was a natural. They wanted Andy behind it, and then of course he went to the TNT stuff, and I was still running some Lee Spring stuff. But I drove the truck in Pontiac, Michigan, ironically, at a U.S. Hot Rod event. And when I went to time in with the truck, and that was my first time behind the wheel of a tube truck, and Bob wanted to see what I could do with it. Like I said, keep in mind, this is all set up for a small driver, so I'm scrunched in this vehicle, and we're leaving the starting line really, really hard, and I come back, and I think we timed in fast time, and they disallowed it for some reason. And I came back to the pits, and I parked, and I told Andy the transmission was going out. And he's like, what do you mean? I'm like, tranny's going out. And we'd had a lot of problems with transmissions with Bigfoot number 8. We were running the Ford C6s, but we really didn't step up to all the good SVO parts in the trannies at that yet. We were kind of playing catch up with our own design, I guess you could say. So I made the next pass, got hung up in between two gears, and we ended up qualifying second. And he come back and he adjusted our tranny. I told him he was doing the same thing, and he's like, "What are you talking about?" So we called Bob and on the radio, two-way radios, and Bob was filming upstairs. He said, "No, it's launching hard, you know." And then Andy come in, he goes, "Well, I know what it is." He goes, "You're carrying the front wheels all the way to the cars." And I'm like, "Do what?" And he's like, "Yeah, you're riding a wheelie all the way to the cars." Well, I thought the transmission was slipping because I'd never driven anything like that had that much torque. And by just riding the back wheels, it just felt like the front end wasn't pulling because there was nothing. No, I didn't have no feel coming through the steering wheel. And it just felt like the tranny was slipping, but it really wasn't. It was pulling hard. And that was probably my, I don't know, second big bump on my head because we went all the way to the finals in Pontiac. And, of course, one lane was really bad and one lane was really good. And I didn't want to run that hard in the right lane, and I ended up having to run the old Invader truck.
Mm-hmm.
And Bob said, "Just go for it. See what it'll do." And I'm like, "I don't know. I don't like how high them ramps are." And, of course, Bob's just like, we're here to win. And I'm like, "Okie doke." So we just bonsaied it, and Bob's got pictures of it up in the air, and it's like what you see on Monster Jam now.
Right.
The truck was twisted up in the air, and when it came down, it landed on the driver's side so violently that we had a bar that went right beside the right side of your head where the halo loop was at, and it went down to the where the dash was located at the time, to the right of the driver. Well, when Andy was in it, his helmet and everything wasn't even close to this halo bar that we had in there. But when I was driving it, my helmet was real close to it, so when it landed on the driver's side, what we call the side slap, it whipped me back to the right. And my helmet went up and hit that bar, and it knocked me unconscious. Well, I kind of turned to the right, and Andy thought I was going to wave to the crowd, and he goes, "Then you just kept going." And I bounced up over a set of scales and just kind of bumped into the wall, and that was my first concussion that I got. But lo and behold, the next week we cut that bar out. We didn't have that bar in there anymore. But it's trial and error that, you know, when you start putting different guys in different trucks, you start seeing things that the regular driver doesn't get to see.
What was it that pushed to building 9? Because that truck seemed to come out very quickly after 8.
Well, we knew that when we had the in-house program with Dan Patrick, we knew we had to step it up quick. Like I said earlier, you know, with 8 being, I guess you could say, banned by TNT, we pushed the envelope so more advanced than anybody else. Even though there was trucks out there that was running a 4-link suspension with the equalizer and the Taurus trucks, and I think Barefoot might have had one at that time. I don't know if he was running a TNT circuit, but they banned us. They wanted everybody else to get a chance to catch up. That was one of their excuses. And even though the truck still weighed 10,000 pounds, or almost 11 at the time, we knew that we needed to bring something else out right after that. And Jim got to doing some research on metals, and you want to try to get as much unsprung weight off the truck as you can. So that's when we decided to go with the chrome moly design, thinking that was going to be better. We went with the lighter weight ZF rear ends, and of course we know that was a mistake. The chrome moly was a mistake. I think at the time we didn't know enough about chrome moly. I mean, Dan Patrick helped build that truck also, but there's a certain process that you have to do to chrome moly, as far as like heat treating some of the areas. We didn't do that, and a lot of when we would actually rip like a cradle off or something, it would tear about a half an inch or an inch from the weld, meaning that, you know, that heat was so concentrated where we were welding at when we were tigging the whole frame together, that if we would have heat treated the whole frame, it would have moved that heat area out. But yeah, 9 had a lot of technical advances on it. Of course, 8 was too. I mean, you know, with the double cantilever design, it was floppy. It was every which way. But we kept pushing through it, and got it on the right track. And of course, number 9, that has to be before. I mean, I love the rear engine trucks, but 9 was a mule. The motor was set back probably 8 to 10 inches back farther than number 8. You had a little compartment that your seat set in to actually drive it, because you had to take all that off even just to get the valve covers off. The motor, the back of the head was right next to the lower part of your seat. That's how far the motor set back. And the weight ratio on that truck was just phenomenal. Even after, when we would bend stuff up, we would replace it with DOM tubing. I think the main frame rails was still quite a bit of chrome moly, but the cradles, the hoops, a lot of the cage and stuff like that eventually got turned over to DOM tubing.
The flexing you talk about in the chassis, that what led to a lot of those. You took a lot of spectacular runs with 9, you and everyone else who ran that truck.
Right.
It was early on. There's the famous crash in Montreal. I don't know that a lot of people know as you.
And getting into the advancements of not only the tube chassis, but with the nitrogen shocks. Bob and them were very good friends with the Strope family, who had off-road buggies. And, of course, when I was crewing with Jim, we done a lot of the late Mickey Thompson series, which was the off-road truck series.
Right.
And we would go to those events, and we would just come out and just run over some cars. And we got to be really good friends with Ivan Stewart, Rick Mears' gang, the Stropes, and we kind of seen that a lot of these things they were using on their trucks could be used on the monster trucks. So then Bob and them got to talking to some folks out in California. They were building the nitrogen shocks, and him and Jim went out there, and they ended up buying the whole lot of everything out. And that was what started our nitrogen shock in-house business. And then we started putting them on 8, and that was our own in-house shocks. And later we became involved with Trailmaster. And Trailmaster took over the design, of course, and they were building some barrels and tubes and whatnot for us, because they had the technology. They were into shock absorbers, of course. But yeah, Montreal was a long track, and that was with the United Sports of America, and they were big into the monster trucks too. Dan Patrick ran for them, Pablo Huffaker, Digger. A lot of teams ran with those guys. They go up and they did a lot of the big venues up in Canada. They did a lot of big venues here stateside, but they were primarily a mud racing organization. And then at Arrowhead one year they had some monsters, and they kind of seen the riding too, and they started developing a monster truck series. But it was, I think, 2 sets of cars or something, and we were having a lot of steering cylinder problems and to this day, a lot of teams still have those problems. Seems like when you pull a shaft apart at the back on your rear steering cylinders, it'll automatically, you lose that pressure. There's nothing holding the pressure, because the steering cylinders actually have pressure on both sides of the piston. That's what controls your vehicle. Well, when you break the shaft off inside, or it just automatically sends all the pressure to one side, and that turns it to lock. You have no control over it. And that's what happened to me. And then it just went over on its side, and I tried to drive out of it. Well, then it folded up underneath of me, and the 4-link bar bent underneath of it, and then we were upside down. And we were running what they call a cam-over seatbelt at the time from RJS.
Mm-hmm.
And I couldn't get out of the truck. I had no way of getting out of the truck. All my weight was pushing on my seatbelt, and I couldn't push the lever to unlatch it because it had so much pressure on the lever. And just an innocent track worker walked up to us and said, "Well, I don't know what you guys are doing in there, but you might ought to speed it up because your truck's on fire."
Right.
Yeah, and actually was the transmission cooler fluid was dripping down on the headers and started a small fire. Well, then immediately it's panic city. We had Lexan windows. Of course, they're not made to break. And Dennis Anderson was kicking with all his might to try to get the front windshield kicked out. Well, it's Lexan. It's not going to break out. And since I was on the driver's side, no one could reach me because that was the side that was down to the ground. We finally got the windshield tore out enough that we could get in there and they could push back on me so we could get the belt unlatched. Long story short, next thing, RJS came out with a new style seat belts that was just a quick release lock that you could turn it probably 20 degrees, and all 5 belts was unlatched, and it was a beveled pin assembly. So we immediately replaced all the older style belts with these new style belts.
That seems to be a big thing in the sport still to this day, is sort of trial and error, because there's really, even testing them, your best test is going to be out on the track. But
right. Well, we had a test track there at St. Louis, not very far from the shop, and when we got the opportunity, if we made a few changes to 8 or 9 at the time, we would load them up and take them over the test track. I mean, Bob was very, very precautious. He always was adamant about, trying this stuff out before we got in front of some of these big buildings. And we knew that this was a totally unknown for us. I mean, these trucks were, we don't have 300-pound leaf springs hanging under them anymore, so we're adjusting 4-link bars, we're changing sway bars out the test track. I mean, we're changing gear ratios, and of course we're making notes of all this stuff, so we have this information at our fingertips when we start really getting into the whole Penda series. We had all this technology we could fall back on. We knew what was working and what wasn't working.
Now, to get into that, I don't want to keep going back to crashes. I want to get into just a little bit into snake bite, and then '93, because that was a big year for you and Bigfoot. But '92 at Nashville.
Yes, that was a USA show also, and we nicknamed Nashville Crashville, because it seemed like every time we had a Bigfoot truck there, it was involved in some type of crash. Whether when we had the Bigfoot Bash #4, I think we tore up a couple other trucks there, not seriously as we did 4, but it seemed like even when Andy would go run 8 there, we'd come back with a bent rim, or it was at the old Speedway, and if people know the old Speedway, it was a great speedway for late model racing. There were some of your former NASCAR stars that got their start there. Darrell Waltrip used to race there. I mean, a lot of big names used to race at the Speedway, and we'd have one lane, what they called the pit lane. So you got a concrete wall, if you imagine just like you would now, a race car track. You have a pit wall on each side. Well, the track side was always a lot wider because that's the racetrack. I ended up you're starting on asphalt, which there's no traction. And once dirt gets thrown on the asphalt, it's even worse, because now you're just spinning on top of the dirt that's on top of the asphalt. From when I was there with the Stomper truck that weighed 12,000 pounds, it didn't matter what you were sitting on. You could get traction and go. Now you're looking at a 10,000-pound vehicle, and it's like a hog on ice. It's skating every which direction. You just can't get it to go. And when it does finally hook up, it's like Katie bar the door and hang on. Well, we were told in the driver's meeting that anybody that ran the grandstand side, which was the track side, once you finished your run, you were supposed to go all the way up to turn number 4. And Nashville had a really high bank track. So you would kind of go down towards the bottom of the track. Through turn 4, and you'd make a loop, turn back towards the uphill side, and come back into the pit. And everybody did that all night long. Well, it come down to me and Gary Porter in the semis, I believe, running. I got crossed up in between the cars, and the truck, when it launched over the second set of cars, it actually landed on the pit wall. And when it did that, my natural instinct, and much like what you see, what you see on television today, is you got to power out of it. Anything you watch, if anybody watch Monster Jam or anything, if somebody's on their side, they're powering out of it. That's the way you got to get these trucks to pull back out of. Well, when I powered out of it, I launched up over the wall, and I gassed the throttle to get the truck to settle down, and when I looked ahead, there was Gary Porter sitting right in front of me. And he did not go down to turn 4. When he got done with his run, he just was going to turn, make a right, and come right into the pit. He didn't know I was coming the other direction. And hindsight's 20/20. I should have turned, it was so fast, I didn't have time to think. And I immediately driving over his truck, and I stopped, and I was out probably before my truck was even off. And I could only think of Gary. And he he was okay, and I helped him get. Sportsman that I was, I felt that bad. I helped him change a 4-link bar, I think, and go over the truck because he had to run Andy in the finals because we had number 8 there also. And it was a bad deal gone worse, I guess you could say. And actually, I was put on probation by the Monster Truck Racing Association after that event. I was probably one of the only drivers at that time. I don't even know if there's been any since then that was actually put on probation. So, with the Monster Truck Racing Association, a lot of promoters looked up to them as an organization to make things safer. And they felt it was their duty to put me on probation because of my driving style.
And that involved you sitting out, or just that you couldn't have any major?
Yeah, well, they basically watched me for the next several months, and I didn't have to actually set out of the truck. I mean, that came later on when I had another accident. But it was more of a observation. A lot of the board of directors would talk to the promoters after the events. I think it was just a month probation or something, and they would talk to them and make sure that I was, doing what I needed to be doing, not driving crazy, not endangering spectators. Or I could have lost my MTRA license, which at that time, MTRA license, you had to have an MTRA license to drive a monster truck. But I got through it. It was a shock to me, but it was well-deserved. I mean, I completely understood and obliged by the rules because I was one of the very first members with John's Stomper truck to attend the Monster Truck Racing Association, and I firmly was a believer in what they were trying to do and to better the sport. And obviously, it's lasted this long, so with the safety guidelines that were put in place and the continually changes that they're making today, it's making the sport a lot safer for the spectators and for the drivers.
Now, to get into snakebite a little, you were the original Colt Cobra. Was that an easy appearance to upkeep?
No. What had happened was that Hot Wheels was designing a complete line of Bigfoot toys. And Jim and myself were in New York City when they launched the initial toy line. But when we're in discussions with Hot Wheels told Bob and Marilyn and the gang at Bigfoot that every hero has a villain. Whether it be, Batman and Robin are facing the Joker, Superman, anytime you go to a toy store, any character that's hanging on, there's a villain that goes along with it. Of course, the kids have to buy the villain too. So that was what they wanted with the snakebite. And I believe the actual name snakebite ties back in with Ford, ironically. But one of the design engineers for the cars at Hot Wheels had sent this conceptual drawing to us, and one of our weekly Tuesday meetings, when Bob was showing us all this toy line, he whipped out this drawing of this truck. And of course it was met with great apprehension. No one wanted to do it. They're like, oh, that's a joke. People are going to laugh at it. And there was a few of us, I don't know. Let's explore it a little more. You think we could build this truck? And we got with George Link at the time of GTF Fiberglass, and he said, yeah, he can build that. And they made the mold, and of course the hood, the first one that they made was like 1,000 pounds, it seemed like. It was big, huge. Well, once Dan Patterson started doing his work and cutting this out, cutting the fenders out, it started getting a lot lighter. But we were on our way to Memphis for the first Pin to Point series, and that would have been, 91. And we were driving down the interstate. I was in my rig. Andy was up ahead of me. And we were talking back and forth on the CB. I had my wife at the time, Susan, with me, and we were trying to come up with names because this was not discussed yet at the shop. We knew this truck was awesome when it was finished. I mean, the paint job, the red, the wheels, we tried to make it look as close to the drawing as possible. And we just got to talking, and myself and my wife Susan came up with the name Colt Cobra from Cobra Creek, Colorado. And the reason why that name came out was because in the past, a lot of your announcers, you'd fill out a spec sheet before you did your car crush. Every event I ever did at, you'd always have to fill out an announcer sheet. If you had any new sponsors or whatever, so they could talk about it while you was out there driving over the cars. But they could never, ever get the driver's name right.
Mm-hmm.
I might be Gene Peterson. I might be Eugene. You know, nothing. So it was actually a slap at the announcers because they would have to say that whole name. And that was my take on it. Colt Cobra from Cobra Creek, Colorado. And then when we got to the event and we unloaded the truck, we really didn't know, you know, of course a lot of other teams, we got there early enough, they looked at the truck and it was on Bigfoot Forest chassis. But it didn't say Bigfoot anywhere on the vehicle. I put the mask on. I just put a white driver's mask on. And there was a magazine there that did our photo shoot on us. And from that point forward, you literally could not pick up a magazine at any newsstand without seeing a picture of Snakebite and this masked character in it. And we ran with it. In fact, at that year's MTRA banquet, I believe it was that year, Mark Hall and them had won an award. And Mark Hall actually stood up and wanted to know who Colt Cobra was. He did not know that it was me. And we kept that. That was probably one of the best secrets that no one ever knew about. And I played it to the hilt. Obviously, we shot 2 videos that was corny as can be for Hot Wheels. That was part of the promo tour. But we had a story every time wherever we went. You know, Bigfoot's loaning me. I used to work at Bigfoot. They're loaning me their rig so I can haul it down the highway. The trailer was just a white trailer. Even when I was tiring down, I had the mask on. I never took the mask off until I got behind the wheel of the semi to go down the highway. And, you know, the first year we had the 1. The next year we had 2. And by that summer of that year, the second year, I think we had 4 bodies running. All the promoters wanted that truck at their event. They wanted Snakebite this was I don't even know what to say. I mean, it was huge. They had to have this truck at their event. We put the Snakebite body on number 9 the second year. We were pretty dominant. In fact, we used to have to hang weight on the truck just to make weight. We were, again, it was a horse. I love that truck. It seemed like we'd come to the end of the year at the Hoosier Dome, we'd be sitting in 3rd or 4th place, and we'd have to go all the way to win the event to get up to 2nd. Andy seemed to get lucky draws, and whether he had 8 or 10 there, and we were not, I won't say we were playing blocker, but we'd play the qualifying games, Andy and I would, and Andy, of course, always wanted to be number 1. He usually had the bigger motor and everything, and we were just doing it on our driving. So it was great. Don't get me wrong. I mean, it made both of us a better person. But even like I know a lot of people thought of the wrestling stuff, but that was something that Andy and I just invented. We just started going back and forth at each other at some of the events, and we even went to Pontiac, Michigan one time, and took Bigfoot and Snakebite up to Pontiac, Michigan with a 16-truck field, and all we had to do is run 3 races against each other. I mean, it was just a grudge match against the Bigfoot and Snakebite. And Bob was very adamant about whoever won needed to go challenge the winner of that night. And we were basically arguing with Bob. It's like, Bob, we're racing each other. This is what we wanted to do. And I think the truck got so big, so quick, that it really didn't have any ties back to Bigfoot. I mean, we didn't even have souvenirs for it. We were making stuff up. I came up with the idea of the Snakebite kit, and then Sally, who was our merchandising manager, started looking at what we could get to put in these little kits, sell them at the shows, and it was one of those things that was unexpected, and it just took off like a wildfire. And probably in 94 possibly 94. We put Team Bigfoot on it, and some of the other guys that were driving the truck didn't want to wear the mask, and it kind of lost its image a little bit, mystique. But that whole first year was just it was fabulous. I loved it.
Now, moving into the '93. Now that was the year that people had seen you on TV and in home video, and '93 you kind of you were the guy in the Bigfoot that we saw on TV week to week. What kind of changes were there for you going from 9 to 10?
Well, rear engine, more suspension, a little bit more suspension. I had driven 10 a little, but just to be able to see, it was completely different truck, similar but different, I guess you could say. We went out, and I knew going into that season that, well, I went into every season wanting to be the champion. The first year with number 4, when we had the snake bite when we first introduced it, I knew there was no way to, I wanted to prove that we could use that truck, and Bob did too, that we could actually be competitive. And then the next year with number 9, we ended up finishing second with number 9, snake bite. And Andy, when we went into that third year, we brought 3 trucks to the event. We had Wildfoot, the snake bite, I believe, and then the Bigfoot truck. I had just had my daughter was born. I won't say I knew my career was ending, but I wanted people to know who'd been behind, who was doing, who was driving, that I could actually drive. I mean, some of my closest friends knew that I was Colt Cobra, but to the real world, they didn't know who Colt Cobra was, and they never. I mean, they do now, or they will know. But I wanted them to know Gene Patterson as a driver. So I think we won several races, and we had a points lead going up until my accident. The truck suited me fine. We were having a lot of problems with 11. The weight distribution was a little bit off. It liked to ride wheelies a lot.
Right.
And it really didn't like to stay down on the ground. And we were trying some newer, bigger shocks on the back of that truck. Just the in-house program, we were really, and you got to keep in mind that at Bigfoot, the race trucks did displays, the race trucks did car crushes, they did the racing. We had just finished number 12 to do a lot of the Ford displays, because we kept telling Bob that we're wearing these race trucks out doing a lot of these displays in these little small arenas. So there really wasn't a lot of time to head back to the test track to try all these new suspensions and do all this new stuff out. It seemed like as we were loading the truck up, we were still bolting items on it to go to a race somewhere. And 11, we were just having some issues with a lot of the axle shafts and stuff and the ZF rear ends, because we changed that. And 10 still ran the standard ones that we'd had before. So it was, I felt good about myself as a driver. And I think a lot of teams out there was, getting worried. Now, not only was it Andy, now here was Gene, and we were a double threat on winning all the time. And guys like Gary Porter and Scott Stevens and all of them, I mean, they stayed with it. I mean, they weren't willing to turn their back, because it made them a better team too. I mean, they were constantly upgrading their personal trucks and stuff. So I think it was good for the sport, but it was, at the same time, it was. I could see from an individual standpoint that if I was a John Breen at that time, it's like I don't have the money to run like that. But 10 was an adjustment for sure, but I seemed to adapt to it really quick. With being in the middle of the truck, it seemed like it was more forgiving. You could drive it a lot better than what you could when you were sitting on one side or the other.
And from '93, some banner wins in '93, of course, on TNN, and you won in Lima, and get a big win in Indianapolis in the rain. To get through that.
And also I think I took 2 out of 4 in Canfield too. And the only reason why I say that, and not to toot my own horn, but I had to run Andy like 3 times. So we kept coming back as fast loser all the time, and we used to run in cab radios. We were probably one of the last teams to run two-way communications. And I remember very distinctively in Canfield when we were pulling up to the line, and as we're pulling into the staging beam, I keyed up my microphone and asked Andy if he had any grapefruit pond mustard. And he started laughing, and we ended up winning. But yeah, Indianapolis in the mud. I had some pretty big scoops on the back, and I think the little lower horsepower that we had, we were a little bit off as far as, I think we had a different gear ratio than what we were running in 11. I know I had to truck a lot tighter, meaning that I had the suspension jacked up a lot harder on it. So the mud was, if you had a lot of suspension, a lot of moving around on it, it was sliding around. But I think the starting line had some holes that were probably about 2 foot deep, and 11 was a little bit longer on wheelbase, so it never really lined up in those holes. So when Andy would have to take off, the back end would actually drop down into those holes, and it would unload the suspension, where 10 was pretty much within a couple inches of everybody else, except for the barefoot trucks that had really, really long wheelbases on them. But, I mean, you were fighting it all the way down the track. They like to push just like a dirt car. It was pushing. It was a huge win, yes. To win at Indianapolis, any type of form of motorsport is something you can always look back on and say, I won at Indianapolis. And then I had the accident in Bloomsburg. We went out and qualified, and again, it seemed like, not to beat a dead horse, but Andy could always get number one. He had that knack of getting good lights, and the truck worked good, and so we would always try to play that qualifying game. We'd always have the brackets. Our crew chiefs would have the brackets. Our first run, we'd make an easy run just to see where we fell and watch everybody else. Then we'd start playing the bracket game to try to make it so if we got through all the rounds, we wouldn't meet till the end, which was very hard to do when you're taking a 10,000-pound truck and there's 15, 16 guys there trying to get into 12-truck field, I guess. But we felt like we knew from the shop what they were sending us, what we could work with. And I went out for qualifying, and I think I qualified number two, and we busted all the cantilevers off the back, bottom of the shocks out, busted the mid plates off the motor, cracked transmission, and we were up all that night. And of course, people that have been to Bloomsburg know it's very warm. And we stayed up probably till 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. A lot of other teams thought they had us on the ropes, but we'd slowly, had steadily over the years learned what we needed to take to these shows, and we'd start taking extra motors and 4 or 5 transmissions. We had a hoist set up. We could change the motor. We pulled the motor out. We had a welder there on that night. Next morning, we was up early, and it just like you could hear the wind get sucked out of everybody's sails that this truck was actually coming back to perform, which was Bigfoot number 10, and we did. And I ended up getting together with. I took a pretty hard bounce, I think, in the second round. Got a back slap on my head. The ground was just really hard. At Bloomsburg, there's a big dip at the end.
Right.
Pitch, and I put an extra set of shocks on it. I don't know if we had the same valving in it that the other ones had. And then when I ran Depth-E in one of the barefoot trucks, he came over and hit the sidewall of my truck. And I remember talking on the radio to my crew chief back on the starting line and said, yeah, I feel fine. And I remember him saying, start the truck up and bring it back up to the pits, and we'll take a look at it. And I remember driving the truck back up there. I remember physically getting out of it, and then I don't remember anything until 1, 2 o'clock in the morning when I was in the hospital. And they told me that I'd suffered mild concussion and heat exhaustion. And they said, God puts this system in our body with our pluses and minuses, our electrolytes, that once we get below a certain level, your body will actually just shut down, completely shut down. and it will kick into overdrive and start building up your plus electrolytes, and that's what happened to me. When I woke up in the hospital, Jim Kramer was sitting there next to me. And I said, well, how bad is the truck? And he goes, what do you mean? I go, well, if I'm in the hospital, that means the truck's completely destroyed. And he goes, you mean you don't remember what happened? I go, no. And then they went and got the doctor, and he came in there, and he explained everything I just said. But I had to set out a race. And next 2 weeks was, I think, Springfield, Missouri. We put a new young gun behind the wheel, which is the kid that I showed how to drive. And at a USA show, I showed him how to do car crushes, and his name was Dan Runte. He'd been driving Snake, and we put him in there, and of course, just much like NASCAR drivers, I did not want to get out of the seat of that truck. I had the points lead. I was not going to give up the seat to this truck, and I think in Springfield we had possibly 3 races again, maybe 2. And I was very hesitant. My first night, and I felt bad then, I still feel bad that I didn't give him any pointers. You know, I just was like, I did not want this man behind the wheel of this truck. And I finally got down off my high horse, and the next day because he went out like second round. And the next day I apologized, and we made some changes to the seat because he said he just didn't feel comfortable. That was his first time actually running on the Penda Series, I believe. And he didn't feel comfortable in the truck, so he didn't want to push it that hard. So the next day we made some changes in the seat belt situation. The seat, we raised the front of the seat up where he was accustomed to it. And those were all built in. We had brackets in all these trucks that we could make them fit different drivers. We carried extra brackets with us, but we never really had to use them because everybody stayed in the same truck. Our steering orbital could go up and down about 2 inches, so we changed that. Just a few little changes, and he did a lot better the second day, but we lost a ton of points there, and we just never made it back up. I actually got back behind the wheel after the Springfield event, but it was, in those days, a couple bad finishes, and you were pretty much out of contention when you got somebody like Andy over there running away.
Right, and the Penda Series was actually, as far as how many races per year, was actually a relatively short series, it seemed like, compared to some of the older series at the time. It kind of run full season, and it was a summer series.
But I really think that, you know, a lot of people look back on that series, and when it started out, it was going to be an open qualifying type format, and then a lot of teams found out, of course, that we were bringing 2 trucks. One was a snake bite, one was a Bigfoot. And they kind of, after the first event, they saw how hard it was and how hard it was even to qualify. And back then, there wasn't a lot of money and to qualify. And a lot of teams said, I can go somewhere else for guaranteed money and not do this. So the next year it was, I think there was guaranteed 12 spots, maybe 14. Or 10 spots, and then 2 open spots. And some races you'd have 6 guys trying to get into 2 spots, and some races you'd only have 2 guys getting 2 spots. But it was pretty much all over the country. I mean, you know, it's still a lot where they run today, but they don't run none of the points anymore. It's more of a timed, accumulative type point series now, I believe. You know, it's not racing. It's not racing like what we used to do.
Mm-hmm. And then following up that year, you didn't leave the sport entirely, but you went from Bigfoot, and then you worked with a couple other operations. And
Right. Well, my daughter was born in '93. My oldest daughter now, who's 21, and I expressed interest that with after this second concussion, that I felt like it was time for me to slow down a little bit. I expressed my concern as far as like trying to take a little bit more time off the road in the winter months to be my daughter. And as it held out, I seemed like I was going more, and I felt it was best for me just to step away. And a friend of mine here in Jefferson City had a monster truck. His name was Donnie Van Loo, and I'd known him for several years. And my wife and myself, was thinking thinking about moving back to Jefferson City anyway. But monster trucks have been a part of my life for 8, 9 years at that time, and I really didn't know what I could do or what I wanted to do. But Donnie offered me a position with his team. He said, "Yeah, I'll move back to Jeff. I'll let you drive my truck." So we immediately put the house up for sale in St. Louis, and I left on, I won't say it was really, really good terms at Bigfoot. There were some things that was going on at the time. And in fact, after I left, they let Andy Brass go several months later. But it was just a transitionary period there that I don't know if it had to do with sponsors, if it, it was just good. It was time to move on. So I moved back to Jefferson City, and I started second guessing, of course, right away. We were working with Chevrolet, the United Sports of America, trying to get some Chevrolet money for Donnie. He had a Hemi. It was an older truck that Dan Patrick had his hand in on it, so I knew that the piece was quality. But there was still, when you go from an elite team, as in Bigfoot, to a medium-level team, it's just really hard. A lot of his stuff was completely different, and we threw right into the Penda series. Well, it wasn't like the olden days when you could go do a car crash. It was right into the fire, and it didn't work out for us. So I picked up the telephone and I called Dan Patrick, and Dan Patrick had since left Bigfoot and had his own racing team. In fact, he brought out his new two-frame truck there on the Penda series, and he said, "Get on an airplane," and I flew to his shop in Circleville, Ohio, and I just started pulling wrenches for him. And when I arrived at his shop in Circleville, his truck was sitting over in a corner. Half the frame was cut off of it from Lima. So he was making some changes to it, and we had to be in Bloomsburg by the end of the week. And he had just started building a lot of chassis and whatnot for several other teams, so his truck was took second seat. And we'd work all day on somebody else's trucks that we were trying to get done, and then we'd work half the night getting his truck ready to go. And we went to Bloomsburg, and of course, a lot of people remember, some might not, but we were the first monster truck on the Penda series, which was 300-some-foot long track, I believe, to run under 5 seconds. It was 4.9 something, I believe.
Right.
And we actually won that event, and we had the old steel rims on the truck. The truck actually weighed like 11,000 pounds. But we made a big cam change right before we went there, and we talked to reputable drag racer by the name of Ken Vinny, who was a real good friend with Dan Patrick. And we came up with a cam grind that we thought we needed to run in that Hemi, because it wasn't the Hemi as far as like when it was in his funny car for pulling. And we came up with a cam grind, and everything just clicked that weekend. We kept spitting O-rings out. We actually had O-rings. The old two-piece rims had O-rings. And we were putting O-rings on the rear end housing, because every run we'd blow an O-ring out, and we'd just hurry up, jack it up, and rip the other one out and slip another one in,
Right.
Try to keep running. And I ran the rest of the season with him. Had an excellent time. I mean, I learned a lot. I actually got behind the wheel of his truck several times. And for those people out there that don't know who Dan Patrick is, I mean, he is a last year inductee into the Monster Truck Hall of Fame. I mean, as I mentioned earlier, he's had two-wheel drive funny cars. He's had tractors. He built drag racer pullers. Over 100 monster trucks for Monster Jam. I mean, the guy he's got it all going on. But there's probably been two other people other than his daughter that's ever driven his monster truck. And he knows everything about his truck and his trailer that he hauls the monster truck in. And just not everybody gets behind the wheel of that. And for him to put his trust and faith in me, I did several shows in Canada. I did one in Denver, Colorado for TV. when USA was doing some TV events. They were trying to get into the indoor market series, and that was with Mike Galloway and Ralph Shaheen. Dan was busy back at the shop trying to put new chassis together, and I went out and drove his truck. And from going down to the Magnum team and coming back up to the Samson team, now I go to not having an automatic to what they call a Linko style with a flipper clutch and a big E-Flack Hemi that made a lot more horsepower than what the Ford motors that even we used to run. But with a Ford and an automatic, you could make up for it, and I had to learn how to drive all over again.
How much of a change is it to wield that kind of power on a small place like the Denver Coliseum or those smaller shows?
I broke my fair share of reversers because reversers was a weak link in those transmissions. But it was so hard to stage the truck, and the truck would load up real easy on fuel. So because we had so much fuel going through it, and it was what they call a dry block, so we didn't run any radiator or anything on the truck. So you ran so much fuel through it. The suspension was so much more softer than even when I was at Bigfoot. Because I think we were running some 28s or something on the rear. He had some big cantilevers on the back, and it would just suck up so nice. It was just so soft. And Dan's customers' trucks was, like I said earlier, he would take care of them first before his own truck. So he was experimenting with sway bars and whatnot on his. And it was difficult to drive inside because of with the slipper clutch when you try to make turns, because a lot of the courses we were doing inside, we were actually turning. They weren't just straight line blast over the cars. So the slipper clutch is either almost on or off. You could go into a turn and it would almost like be freewheeling, where it would be idling, and the truck would be rolling by itself. So then when you got into the throttle, it would just hook up real quick, so you had to be ready for it. Where like with an automatic, you could keep constant power to the wheels, and you could drive it a lot more. And that was the only big difference. It took me a while to get used to that.
And how long were you at Dan's? I know you did eventually do another stint at Bigfoot. How long were you with Dan Patrick?
Only that year, and then I traveled off and on. The next few years, I did some events because I actually drove a truck here in Jefferson City. In the winter months, it'd get really slow. So Dan would be at the shop, like I said earlier, building customers' trucks, and he put me out and let me take his truck. And I went up into Canada to do some at the Sky Dome. I went up, did that with his truck, Portland, Oregon. Then he flew out with me in Oregon and helped me drive the rig and everything back home. And that was his first time really sitting on the ground as a crew member to watch the truck. And in Portland, and he himself couldn't believe how hard that truck used to leave, because it used to leave really, really hard with the slipper clutch. And it actually helped him as a builder and a tuner to change his truck, to make it more drivable and to actually see what a nice piece that he'd put together. But it was just about a year and a half, and it wasn't full-time. Like I said, I was driving a truck here in Jefferson City because I was living in Jefferson City at the time. And I would help him out in the winter months. And then, like you begin to say, in 1998, Jim Kramer had started contacting me again here in Jefferson City. And I, for the like of me, couldn't understand why. I still stayed following monster trucks. I would talk to Patrick, which I still do. I talked to Dan about once a month back then, and just trying to keep up. I'd go to the Monster Jam show in St. Louis, and kept up with a few people as far as what the industry was doing. At that time, Monster Jam was in the process of, had already bought out a couple smaller teams, and Bigfoot was contacting me, and I finally went up to meet with Jim, and he wanted to know if I'd be interested in coming back to work for him, and I said, well, yeah, I don't think we left on the greatest terms around, but over the last 2 years, we seem to be back on speaking, and we decided, what was in the past was in the past, and let's make another run at this. So I actually worked in the marketing department at Bigfoot, and then I drove the truck at some events. And that was probably when, like I said, the whole Monster Jam company at the time, which was another company, had started buying out several teams, and there was a lot of turmoil in the industry, and we seemed to have a firm hold on. We were doing a lot of other events other than just racing, so that played into our corner, I guess. And eventually, though, there were some things that was done that we, as a team at Bigfoot, ended up on the backside of where we needed to be, but we made the best of it. What do you do? Well, they say you got to make lemons out of somehow, whatever that thing is, and that's what we did.
And of course, during the Bigfoot stint, there was the Monster Trucks 2000, but you also had another pretty major flip there.
Nick, you keep bringing up these crashes.
Yeah, I'm trying to step past them, but you keep answering so many of my questions.
We were doing some air shows at the time, and Eric Meager and myself was at a air show convention in Nashville, and he brought up to me, because I was working in marketing and helped booking the trucks at Bigfoot, what I thought about this idea that what you just called it, Monster Truck 2000, and I said, well, it could be something out there. People are looking for other avenues to pitch these monster trucks to. So he didn't lay out the whole concept, and I kind of got involved and met some of the producers in the office, and they really they watched, like the old Coke Over, the old snakebite stuff, and they said, we want, you need to drive. We're going to put you in this villainous type truck, and at the time we had the Sting body. Scorpion, they called it then, but before it was a Sting truck, and it looked pretty sharp, and it was on number 11, and the track was real sandy. I hadn't been in the seat for several months, probably close to a year maybe, other than just doing some car crashes here and there filling in, so I really hadn't been racing any of the newer trucks. Made some dry runs during the day, and I kept telling the crew that the truck didn't feel right. The truck felt real lazy, felt real soft. They said, oh, it's just the sand, it's just the sand. I'm like, no, I've been around this long enough, I don't think that's what it is. And we changed a bunch of stuff on the shock, but we weren't blessed with the external bypasses that a lot of the teams, including Bigfoot, run now. So short of disassembling all the shocks and revalving, and we had to run what we had. We changed the gas pressure, and we just got into the end there when we were running run day, and when I hit that last hill, the back suspension sucked up so hard that's why a lot of trucks flip through the air. You bottom out, and it's just imagine if somebody was to hit yourself or whatever, your head goes back. Well, that's what the trucks were doing, and they were bottoming out, and then as you rotate through the air, it tries to switch ends, what we call it. So the back end was trying to fall the front end over, and when it come into the ground for the nose-in landing, I immediately powered back into it, and it stood up into a wheel stand, and the notorious steering cylinder bit me again and throwed it over into a side wheel spin. And I had time to think about it. For looking back at it, there was a tractor trailer we had parked one of our own rigs so that trucks wouldn't go out into the pit area in case there was an accident. And I could remember thinking that, am I going to stop before I hit that? And I got out, and of course, they had to change the whole script. And we'd been sitting in the trucks quite a while prior to me even making my pass. And I'm not making excuses. I just overdrove the truck for what the conditions were. And I decided after that, the next week, that it was time for me to actually step away from behind the wheel, because I had a family, and I had another one at the time, my other daughter, and I thought they were more important to me than, because the whole safety stuff really hadn't hit its stride yet. We were still using the beard style seats with the suspension, and I just knew that unless I drove a truck every week, that I just needed to get away from it for a while, and that's when I stepped out permanently from behind the wheel. Then here 3 years ago, a company I was working for nearly 10 years told us on Thanksgiving Day that we were going to be closing come January 1. And I had no idea what to do. You put 10 years of your life into this company. Like I said, I mean, I'd go to some winter shows with Dan and see some monster trucks around my area, but nothing full time. And I'd actually sent an email to one of my friends that works at Monster Jam. And I got a call that night. And they told me there'd be a car waiting in Jefferson City for me to go pick it up and drive to Indianapolis. And I go, what am I going to do? And they go, we'll tell you when you get there. And I drove to Indianapolis to the Lucas Oil Stadium and was the co-crew chief on the Superman truck and the Lucas Oil Crusader. And they'd been hiring a lot of new people, and they had no idea what a monster truck was. These roadies, and I jumped right in the very first day I was there, helped change the third member, introduced myself. The guy didn't. He goes, how did you get here? I said, dude, I was doing this 15 years ago, and nothing has changed. And I did the crew chief there, St. Louis, and Las Vegas at the final. So I'd been out of the sport for nearly 10 years, but several people that I competed with that now work for Monster Jam knew me, and they gave me that chance to go work for them. And I fell right back in with it. And I would probably still be with them today if it wouldn't have required me to move to Chicago. But I'm doing this now, and so then I kind of step away from it, and I'm getting my feet wet again. And my family's like, "Are you sure you want to do this? You sure you want?" I don't know. So we're at a school, and we're looking at some books to talk about monster trucks, and I open it up, and there I am. There's a picture from Lima, Ohio, and it said, like, driver Gene Patterson wheels Bigfoot to victory, and it was just a kid's book, and there happened to be a local deputy there. He started talking. I showed him the picture, and he's like, "That's not you." And I go, "Yeah, it is." We started talking, and he had been instrumental in the DARE program here in our local area. And this would have been 2 years ago. We did one at the school where my daughter goes, and just down the road from me, there happens to be an individual that lives that has an old Carter Bigfoot monster truck that we used to haul around with us in the 80s and 90s to try to sell them. And I seen him at a car show, so I made contact with him, and we actually take that truck to the schools. And I get up and I explain how my situation started, much like what we've talked about tonight, how I got started in monster trucks, how staying in school got my education and doing everything I needed to do. And we had pictures out. Well, we did 2, I think, first year, and then this year we did 7 events with the DARE program. The local Sheriff's Association of deputies have already set up probably a dozen for next year. That I'm very, very fortunate to be able to get back into the industry and tell the gospel of monster trucks to these kids. A lot of the kids know about Monster Jam, but they don't know how the whole monster truck scene got started. And I just talk about how it got started and whatnot. And it's such a pleasure to see these kids and see how their faces light up. And we show a video clip of a lot of my days in snakebite and Bigfoot, and to have the kids there knowing that, you know, here's a race car driver, you know, is in the movies and worked at Bigfoot. So it's really cool. Yeah, I'm very honored to be able to carry on that tradition, you know, and still stay involved in monster trucks. But now it's just, I think I have a different purpose now.
And what are you up to, or what are you up to these days?
Well, I am a local, I'm a sheet metal worker, Local 36. I work for an industrial company here in Jefferson City. This will be my 3rd year with them, and that's what I was doing prior to that. I'm actively into the DARE program with the kids. I'm still in touch with Patrick. We did the World Finals several years ago. We did them 2 years in a row, where we actually went out and took his business, a lot of components, out to the World Finals, and I met a lot of fans that remember me from driving, made a lot of new fans, met a lot of guys that are still racing today, the Jimmy Kohlers, the Tom Mintz. Tom Mintz actually came up to me in Kansas City one year when we were doing a show there, and he was doing his mud car then, and he came up and he goes, "I'm thinking about getting into monster trucks." And I just looked at him. I said, "You're nuts." I said, "You need to stay away from this stuff." And look where he's at today. So it was great to see him. Of course, the International Monster Truck Hall of Fame being its 4th year, and it's getting bigger and bigger. And I wish I could be more active in it. I constantly think of ideas and stuff how to make it better, but the fact of the matter is, even to have a small museum like they have there, is that I think everybody, all the teams need to get behind, because this is a sport that some people didn't give it 5 years, 10 years, and it's done 30 years plus, and it's still going strong. There's a lot of dirt track car racers out there that don't even have a Hall of Fame. They don't even have a museum, and it's sad. I mean, these guys run every week in different forms of motorsport. They don't even have this, so it's very huge for me. I'm very honored to even have been nominated this year for the Hall of Fame. I don't know what will happen come September, but I know I'm just as much a fan of monster trucks today as I was when I was standing on that pit wall when I seen Bigfoot do its first car crush. And I would get behind the wheel one immediately. I don't think I could do the big freestyle stuff they do now, but I would love to get behind the wheel of one of these newer trucks with all those suspensions and go out there and do some racing. I think I still got to drive. I know that. I just wish there was some different venues and different series where it could get seen a lot more, just like it used to.
The vehicles today, the way, as far as the promotion seeming to go toward more of the spectacle and less, I don't want to say less competition edge, but it does seem to have gone to a very different place than you would have thought in the 90s.
Right. And one thing, looking back, we were very hesitant even at Team Bigfoot. We wanted to race. Andy wanted to race. I wanted to race. Dan Runte wanted to race. We didn't look at it as an entertainment industry. We wanted to prove that we were just more than crushing cars. We wanted to prove to people out there that these monster trucks could do the unexpected. I mean, Don Garber's climbed behind the wheel of one of the Bigfoot trucks in Indianapolis at the Hoosier Dome, when they called it the Hoosier Dome. People in different forms of motorsports was taking note on these monster trucks and their capabilities, from their suspension to how fast they really were. And they might have had families, and they knew about these monster trucks. So we were very, very reluctant to go. And Bob kept, he'd kind of say from time to time, well, it is an entertainment industry. We didn't want it to be an entertainment. We didn't want to be that sideshow. We were thinking, 3 days of like what U.S. Hot Rod tried to do at Truck Fest. We had visions of really making this into a full-fledged racing motorsport series. Well, after a lot of the teams that were purchased and bought out, and it seemed like that racing kind of took second fiddle, the whole Monster Jam, which is the biggest one out there right now, I mean, they painted themselves into a corner. They went with the wrestling type thing when wrestling was a big hit, and then with the whole freestyle. I mean, we never used to do freestyle. Freestyle was our car crushing. When the freestyle come, and this guy would go out there and tear stuff up, and even Dennis Anderson, whenever he was running on TNT, when he used to run the TNT, he'd go out there and make one run. He knew his stuff could hold together for one run. Well, if he could take out a telephone pole or get up on two wheels, jump a cart rail, he called that his T-shirt run. And that went into where we're at now. And I think a lot of the competitors want to see racing. You go to the Las Vegas World Finals, every team out there wants to win that racing portion of it.
Right.
But that's their only time of the year. And even during the year, I guess I should say, a lot of the bigger stadiums, they're racers. Lindsey Wink, he's a huge racer at heart. He wants to win.
Right.
Cody Saucier with the Monster Energy, he's a racer. They want to race. But they know that the fans in the stands want to see destruction. And that's where they paint themselves in the corner. I've been to several events where the shows are excellent from racing standpoint, and the freestyle is lackluster. When you're leaving the stadium, people are disappointed. They're just, I just can't believe no one tore up. I can't believe. And we, as racers, wanted to be able to load our trucks up,
right,
in one piece and go to the next event. I mean, Bigfoot, that's what we used to have to do. I mean, we had to get it back to the shop. Today's generation is just trash and bash. I mean, it's crash and run, and the drivers are getting on airplanes and they're flying home, and the crew's getting on airplanes and flying home and leaving it with big piles to the next event. And it's great for the manufacturers that manufacture all these parts, but I don't really know. I don't have a definitive answer on how to get back to, the racing part of it. It would take a competitor to compete with the Monster Jam industry to come out with a racing, and obviously you have to have TV.
Right.
TV is a big proponent. When we run Independent Series, that was why a lot of guys, independent teams, Mark Hall and them with the Executioner trucks back then, they wanted to get on TV. TV pays the bills. TV can see that guy like me or Joe Schmo sitting on the couch that owns a Fortune 500 company, and he sees a guy like John Breen with a truck with Mad Dog, and I want to give that guy some money. They don't get to see them now, not on the racing side of it. And a lot of the bigger corporate companies are in it to get their product out there for product awareness, but it's evolved into 100% entertainment, and that's what it is. There's just not a true, legitimate racing series, and that's not bad. It's just I don't have an answer how we can go back to that.
If you take a series though that like I know Pro MT suffered quite a bit because of not getting television coverage and the advertising suffering for that series. Is there a series now that you could see maybe bringing it back, or is it still kind of too up in the air?
Yeah, I'm not as much heavily involved as I used to be. The Pro MT had merits. We were with the right organization because I actually went with Patrick to several of those shows. And if you can imagine a NASCAR track sitting vacant all year long, except for maybe one or two races that they have, it was a perfect venue. I just think the marketing of it and the marketing personnel that we're trying to market weren't completely on board with the product that we were trying to sell. And without having the television, again, that's like one strike, and it's I don't know if there'll ever be one come back, but I also know that as we're talking like now, and I talk about the entertainment industry, I know that like when I go to St. Louis to the show, it's sold out every year.
Right.
And it's packed all the way to the roof. Now, if you brought in 26 trucks and run side-by-side racing inside that building, or SoCal-style track, and that was it, and no freestyle, would you pack it to the rafters? No, you wouldn't. And it's been built up to this high class of this, like I said, trash and bash, and there's really no way to go backwards from that. The only way you can do it is to get somebody with some deep pockets, possibly, and with the television to come out and run a legitimate racing series. And even then, it's going to take probably 2 to 4 years before the public's even going to get behind it. The fans like you and me and everybody else, we're going to go, but the families that go to a lot of these big stadium shows and even the smaller shows where the freestyle rules, they're not going to go see this racing event. I just wish there was another promoter out there that has deep enough pockets. I mean, there's some great promoters out there right now, and they do a fantastic winter series and summer series, but I just wish there was some stuff out there that, of course, you know, with all Speed Network. So I don't know where the industry is going as a whole. I know Dan Patrick's extremely busy right now. Again, a lot of the guys that are behind the wheel, the Kohlers and them, they all want to race. And I guess when you get that little glimmer, like we were talking about, you were talking about the racers want to race. But they know ultimately that, you know, it is a show.
Now, this is my final question for you. What would be your career highlight?
Well, one that really comes to mind is when we brought the snake bite truck out in 1991, and I was awarded an award by Peter, the Off-Road magazine that I actually had my photograph published in 1985. That same magazine awarded me an award as a mover and shaker in the monster truck industry. I was in the same league as Evan Evans, which is a paraplegic off-road racer, Keith Black, known for the Hemi, and to be honored with that, and even though it wasn't Gene Patterson, it was Colt Cobra, that's probably one of my bigger highlights, because that award has never been given since then, ever, to any other monster truck team or driver. I mean, that was 1991. And then probably my days on Roadhouse. I come up from a town that had 200 people in it, and I sat next to Sam Elliott every day, you know. Yeah, that's not something that just happens every day. And of course, working for Bigfoot. They were the original monster truck and the ultimate team that so many other teams tried to be. And to know that I drove for them it's really huge. I mean, that's a big deal. And I mean, there's not just one particular thing that steps out except for that award, but a lot of the other team and you know, several years ago when the Monster Jam people know that I made such an impact in the industry, and not knowing that I did, but now as I grow older, I find out that I really did, and that's a huge accomplishment to me.
I do really want to thank you for being our first.
No problem. I enjoy the heck out of it. Like I said, I enjoy giving the insight to where the industry actually came from, because there is a lot of new fans out there that attend a monster truck event, and they don't get a chance to live the history of the monster truck from where they actually come from. I mean, they know what they see on TV, and they think that's where it all started. Well, it's not. I mean, we started out as a sideshow. We started out at trucks and tractor pulls, and we would sit there all the way through the truck and tractor pull, and then we'd come out and creep over some cars. So I know some people, like I said, they said it would never last. It's here. Some people say it's bigger than ever. Some people say we've got a long way to go yet, and I still believe that we do have a long way to go.